Welcome to the Note Nuggets podcast, where you can learn how to become the bank, build wealth, and accumulate streams of income perfect for your savings or IRAs. You'll hear from industry experts, seasoned veterans, and everyday investors. Our goal is to teach you how to invest in notes, one nugget of knowledge at a time. Here's your host, Kevin Galang.
Welcome to another episode of the Note Nuggets podcast, where you learn how to turn other people's debt into income for your savings or IRA. Today, we're talking about underwriting. The term underwriting gets thrown around a lot in the real estate industry. It's particularly important in the note investing space because as a lender, you are held to a certain standard. And after the 2008 mortgage crisis, some rules and regulations were put in place to help prevent predatory lending and protect the borrower. For example, if you are a predatory lender and you're caught on repeat occasions violating certain compliance rules, it could cost you six figures. I don't know about you, but that's not something I would particularly like to gamble with, nor would I be that type of lender that would be seen as predatory. Which is why it's important to have someone like our guest to help ensure that you are within the compliance rules and doing things the right way. Before we dive into today's Note Nugget about understanding the underwriting process, let's learn about our guest. Russ O'Donnell is the CEO and founder of Call the Underwriter. He and his team help note buyers, note sellers, and seller financiers stay Dodd-Frank compliant. They know compliance can be tricky for note investors, and they are driven to help ensure each transaction meets Dodd-Frank's ability to repay requirements. They say, together, let's get compliant. Okay, so when we talk about Dodd-Frank, you've mentioned it a couple times already. I understand it's a law, and I understand kind of why it came to be, but can you explain a little bit more for those who are kind of hearing those terms and are still unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So Dodd-Frank is exactly that. It was a law passed in 2010 after the mortgage crash that basically said, look, no more. We're not doing this anymore. You're going to have to qualify. And when 2014 rolled around, the ability to repay portion of Dodd-Frank was actually passed that said, for a mortgage loan, if you're going to occupy a 1 to 4 unit dwelling, you're going to have to qualify. You're going to have to put up some income documents, and the lender is going to have to, through underwriting, ensure that you as a buyer can make these payments.
Okay, that makes sense there. So if you were to summarize the process of underwriting, I'm hearing things like verifying income, gathering those documents. How would you describe it, in a few steps?
Yeah. So let's just take for example, we'll kind of run through the process here real quick. So let's just say that Kevin, you're a seller finance investor, and I'm a potential buyer. I answered your ad, and I heard seller finance, and I had a bankruptcy a year ago, and Wells Fargo's not going to give me a loan, and so, but I want to buy this house. I've got a decent down payment. I've turned the corner from whatever life event. I'm just missing something necessary for traditional financing, and so you as a lender have the same requirements as Wells Fargo to make sure that I have the ability to repay. So you're going to do a few things. For the seller finance investor, it's pretty simple. If you just follow, we have a submission sheet that we issue that if you just follow the bouncing ball, it makes underwriting really, really simple. And so you're going to have me fill out a loan application. You're going to have me sign a borrower's authorization so that you can pull credit. And you're going to collect my income documents based on the way I make my money. And so, and our submission sheet lays all of that out. So however the borrower makes the money, that's what's collected. You're going to turn those into your underwriter. If you're not an underwriter, you're going to turn those into your underwriter to make sure that based on the documents I've given, that I make enough money to qualify to meet Dodd-Frank ability to repay requirements for the transaction.
Okay. All right. And that makes a lot of sense. So then it's put in place such that somebody making minimum wage isn't able to get a $500,000 mortgage because you're setting them up for failure. Is that right?
I think that's a really great analogy. You're absolutely right. It's, somebody that's making a minimal amount of money, just because they show up in a fancy car and a good down payment, they have to be able to show that they can make the payment. And, we had an example yesterday where we had an investor say, well, my buyer has a 35% debt ratio. Why don't they meet requirements? Well, good question. Dodd-Frank isn't predicated on debt to income ratio. It's predicated on, do you have enough money? And so we have to run a couple of tools in addition to calculating a debt ratio, just to make sure the money's there. So, and in this instance, there was an elderly person who was applying. They only made about $1,200 a month on fixed income. And even though the new mortgage was only going to be about $350, $400, at the end of the day, there wasn't enough money left over after that to meet living requirements. And there's an algorithm that Dodd-Frank uses to make sure that a person has enough net income. And even though the debt ratio was pretty low, they still didn't meet requirements. So it's unfortunate, but to an investor, just think of Dodd-Frank as your greatest friend. I mean, for one, you know that the buyer is going to qualify to make your payments. So you've got a better chance of that loan performing. Number two, it's going to protect the asset, meaning that if you ever have to foreclose and that borrower challenges whether or not you met the rule, the Dodd-Frank rule, that's going to protect you from having your lien invalidated and giving up that asset. And then number three, if you ever go to sell it, we all know that Dodd-Frank compliant loans pull more money than non-compliant.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier what the value of Dodd-Frank is for the borrower. It kind of protects them so that they don't get into hot water that they didn't realize that they were in hot water.
You're right.
From an investor perspective, how is this beneficial?
Oh boy. Well, like we just said, it's when you underwrite a borrower, you kind of open all those dark drawers, and you find out what's really going on. When we pull a credit report, you can't hide from your credit report. And while Dodd-Frank isn't predicated on a credit score, there's no minimum credit score requirement. It is going to show us, maybe what happened. We're going to have the borrower address these issues. Underwriters want to connect all the dots for the investor, just so that the investor knows what they're getting into. Sometimes we're very eager. We've got another investor who's put up some money for us. We've fixed a property. We're on the hook for those payments. We want to get a buyer in there. But I would just urge every investor, slow down, let the underwriting process happen. It doesn't take very long. But that in itself will give you some security to know that buyer is going to make the payment so that you can make your payment if that's your deal structure. But
Right.
We're all doing this for one reason, and that's to have performing loans.
Underwriting is a key component of due diligence, especially when you originate a note. Utilizing someone like Russ can help ensure that you're doing things in compliance to avoid making huge lender errors. To learn more about the underwriting process and why it's important to note investors, head over to notenuggets.com/underwrite. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Note Nuggets podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get access to additional weekly value nuggets and get notified with episode updates. To subscribe, all you have to do is head over to subscribe.notenuggets.com. If you have any questions about this episode or note investing, book a time on Kevin's calendar at contact.notenuggets.com. We'll see you next week with another note nugget to add to your tool belt.